He didn't raise his voice. He raised his hand. Dr. Harrison Jones, chief surgeon of St. Mercy's Hospital, grabbed the nurse by her ponytail and yanked her head backward in front of the entire emergency room staff. Not one person moved. Not one person breathed. The monitors beeped, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and a man's life hung on a table 6 feet away. And the most powerful doctor in that building had just put his hands on a woman who never asked for a single moment of his attention. What happened in the next 4 seconds would change everything inside those walls. And nobody in that room would ever be the same again. Before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. Miriam Gray arrived at St. Mercy's Hospital at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. She always came early, not because anyone told her to, not because she was chasing overtime, but because early meant she could check on her patients before the day swallowed everything whole. She walked the hallway with her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Her dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail that had been through better days. Her blue scrubs slightly faded from too many wash cycles. She looked like the kind of person you pass in a corridor and forget by the time you reach the elevator. That was exactly how she preferred it. She stopped at the nurse's station and picked up the overnight report from Dana Reyes, a young nurse barely 2 years out of school, who still had the nervous energy of someone trying to prove something to everyone in the room. "Quiet night," Dana said, sliding the clipboard across the counter. "2 post-ops stable, 1 cardiac monitoring for discharge pending labs, and a guy in Bay 4 who keeps pulling out his IV. "I know about Bay 4, Miriam said. "I'll check on him first." "He's been asking for you, actually," said the other nurses scare him. Dana smiled. "I don't know if that's a compliment to you or an insult to the rest of us." "Probably both," Miriam said, and she was already walking. Bay 4 held a man named Gerald Putnam, 68 years old, retired postal worker, admitted 3 days ago for a severe gallbladder infection. He was the kind of patient who asked too many questions and trusted too few answers, which in Miriam's experience meant he was smarter than most. She pushed through the curtain and found him sitting upright, his arms stretched out at an odd angle to avoid the IV line he'd half pulled from its tape. "You're going to blow that vein," she said, not accusatory, just factual. "It itches," he said. "Everything itches. The bed itches, the gown itches, that monitor that goes off every 12 minutes itches my soul." "I'm going to retape this," she said, pulling on her gloves. "And you're going to hold still." "I am holding still." "You are vibrating Gerald." He laughed at that, a short bark of a laugh, and then let his arm go slack. She worked quickly, firmly resecuring the line with practiced hands that didn't hesitate. He watched her the way patients sometimes did when they couldn't sleep and had nothing else to look at carefully, like they were trying to read something written in a language they almost knew. "You were military," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't look up. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move. My son was Army. 12 years. He moves like you do, like he's always ready for something." "I'm always ready for something," she said. "I work in an ER." He smiled, but he kept watching her. "It's not the same thing, and you know it." She finished the tape, smoothed it down with her thumb, and straightened up. "Get some sleep, Gerald. Labs come back this afternoon. If everything looks good, you might be going home tomorrow." "You'll be here tomorrow." "I'll be here." She left Bay 4 and moved through the rest of her checks methodically, efficiently, quietly. That was the rhythm of an early morning in the ER before the day officially opened its mouth and started screaming. For about 40 minutes, she had something close to peace. It ended when the radio crackled at the ambulance bay and the triage nurse at the main desk called out the words that changed the temperature of every room they entered. "Incoming trauma, ET, A4 minutes. Motorcyclist unrestrained, struck by an SUV at highway speed. BP crashing on scene, GCS 7. The ER came alive like a body hit with a defibrillator. Nurses moved to positions. A resident started pulling equipment. The charge nurse began clearing Bay 1, the trauma bay, with a series of rapid-fire instructions that overlapped each other in the controlled chaos that was somehow always controlled. Miriam moved to her position without being told. She knew her role. She'd had roles in places where the stakes were so much higher and the resources so much thinner that this level of preparation felt almost luxurious. She pulled on fresh gloves, checked the crash cart with a quick sweep of her eyes, and waited. Dr. Harrison Jones arrived 60 seconds later. He was the kind of man who entered a room the way a weather system entered a coastline. Before you saw him, you felt the pressure change. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples and a jaw set permanently to a position that communicated he had already decided he was the most important person wherever he stood. His white coat was immaculate. His badge caught the light. Two residents trailed behind him like ducklings who had learned that falling behind meant getting snapped at. "What are we looking at?" he said to no one in particular and everyone at once. "Motorcyclist high-speed impact," the charge nurse Patricia Owens reported. BP was 60 over palp on scene. They've got two large bore IVs running, but he's been losing ground the whole transport. He bleeding out or shutting down? Both probably. Jones made a sound in his throat that was not quite approval and not quite dismissal. He moved to the head of the bay and positioned himself the way he always did at the center of everything, hands already itching for gloves. "All right, somebody get me a trauma kit and tell radiology we're going to need them on standby. And where is my other resident I told Nguyen to be here?" "Dr. Nguyen is coming from the fourth floor," someone said. "Then he should have left sooner." Jones pulled on his gloves with two sharp snaps. "Everyone else wake up. This isn't a drill." The paramedics came through the doors at a run and the gurney rattling hard under the weight of a man who looked like he'd been through something catastrophic because he had. The report came rapid and clipped, name unknown, approximately 35 years old. No helmet, thrown clear of the bike. Blunt abdominal trauma confirmed, possible internal hemorrhage, oxygen saturation had been dropping in the last 3 minutes. That last part caught Miriam's ear. She watched as the team transferred the patient to the trauma bay table, and Jones immediately began calling for a focused abdominal assessment, directing the resident closest to him to begin palpating for bleeding. The team moved around each other with the practiced fluidity of people who'd done this together many times. But Miriam was watching the monitor. His O2 sat had been dropping in transport. It was at 89 now. That wasn't bleeding, or it wasn't only bleeding. She looked at the rise and fall of his chest, uneven, left side lagging. She looked at his neck. The trachea was not exactly where it should be. She took one step forward. "Dr. Jones." He didn't look at her. "Get me that ultrasound." "Dr. Jones, his oxygen saturation is 89, and his trachea may be deviated. I think we need to assess the airway before deform. I can see his oxygen saturation, nurse." He still didn't look at her. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 19 years. I think I know what order to run a primary survey." "His left chest isn't moving right," she said. "Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. I'm seeing decreased expansion on the left. That could be a tension pneumo building." Jones looked up then. He looked at her the way some people look at background noise, acknowledging it exists without granting it any real significance. "And you are Miriam Gray, charge nurse, trauma bay." "Miriam," he said with the kind of deliberate patience that is the thinnest possible skin over contempt. "I appreciate your observation. Now, please let me and my team do our jobs." The resident with the ultrasound moved in. Jones redirected his attention fully to the abdomen, which was showing the signs of internal bleeding he'd expected. The team followed his lead. That was how it worked. He was the surgeon. He decided. Miriam stepped back, but she did not stop watching the monitor. 87, 86, the patient's color was changing. There was a quality to his breathing now, a strained mechanical quality that she had heard before in places she didn't talk about at times, when the difference between doing something and waiting had been the difference between a man coming home and a body bag. She had been trained to act in those moments. She had been trained to read the signs that everyone else was still compiling into data while the situation had already made its decision. 84. "His sat is dropping," she said again, louder. "I know," Jones said without turning around. "It's dropped 5 points in 90 seconds. If he has a tension pneumothorax building." "If you say tension pneumothorax one more time," Jones said, and now he turned. Now he looked at her with the full force of his irritation trained directly on her face. "I am going to have you removed from this bay. Is that clear?" The room went still for just a fraction of a second. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of people holding their breath. Miriam held his gaze. "I understand your position, Dr. Jones. I'm asking you to look at the left chest." "I am managing a hemorrhage." "You're managing the hemorrhage you expected. I'm telling you, there may be something you didn't." Something shifted in his expression then. Not agreement. Something harder than that. The irritation of a man who was never contradicted in his own domain, being contradicted twice in 3 minutes by a nurse in faded scrubs who hadn't flinched once. He turned back to the patient, and for a moment Miriam thought maybe he'll look, maybe he'll check. He didn't. "Continue with the abdominal assessment," he said. "Get me the OR on the line. We're going to need to take him up." Miriam looked at the monitor. 81. The patient's blood pressure was doing something unstable. His respiratory rate was climbing, which was the body trying to compensate for lungs that weren't getting enough room to work. She had seen this exact pattern. She had seen it in a field hospital in a country she was not allowed to name, and she had seen it in the 3 seconds before everything went wrong, and she had learned at a cost she still carried never to wait for permission when she was certain. She stepped forward. I need a 14-gauge needle, she said to the supply nurse beside her. Not loudly, just firmly. The supply nurse, a woman named Christine who'd worked trauma for 11 years, looked at her, then at Jones, then back at Miriam. She had seen a lot of things in 11 years. She had learned to read people. She reached for the supply tray. Jones heard the movement. He turned. What are you doing? His voice had crossed the line from controlled into something more dangerous. I'm preparing for a needle decompression, Miriam said. His SAT is at 81 and dropping. He's in respiratory distress, and the pattern is consistent with, put that down. Jones moved. He crossed the space between them in 3 steps and put himself between Miriam and the patient. You do not perform procedures in my trauma bay without my authorization. Do you understand me? You are a nurse. You assess and you report. You do not decide. Someone needs to decide, Miriam said. The monitor alarm started, then the long, insistent tone that means a threshold has been crossed, and the machine is now as worried as the people should be. 78, heart rate spiking. Get her out of this bay, Jones said. Nobody moved. He turned to look at them, the residents, the nurses Christine, with her hands still hovering over the tray, and found 12 faces that were not quite doing what he'd said. Not because they were defying him, because they were watching Miriam, and something in the way she was standing, the way she was looking at the patient, the quality of her stillness, made moving feel like the wrong answer. Jones turned back to Miriam. His jaw was tight. His eyes were sharp with a fury that had nowhere else to go. I said, get out. Check his left chest, she said. One more time, quietly, like she had all the time in the world and was simply waiting for him to catch fire. What happened next happened fast. Jones reached out his hand, closing around her ponytail. The movement sharp and sudden and ugly, pulling her head back with a force that snapped the room into an entirely different register. A gasp went through the staff, not loud, more like a collective inhale that nobody planned. Someone said his name once, low and stunned. The patient's monitor kept alarming. 76. Miriam did not cry out. She did not go rigid with fear or crumple with pain. Her eyes in the half-second after the grab were steady and dark and measuring the way the eyes of someone measure a situation when they have been in worse ones and know exactly what their body is capable of. It took less than 2 seconds. Her left hand came up and found the precise point on the inside of his wrist where pressure applied correctly transforms into something involuntary. His grip released, not gradually, immediately. She stepped forward and slightly to the side using the momentum he'd given her. And Jones stumbled backward 2 full steps, his arm extended awkwardly, his wrist limp where she'd pressed his face, cycling through several expressions at once. Shock, pain, rage, and something underneath, all of those that might have been, if you looked carefully, fear. The room did not make a sound. Miriam adjusted the collar of her scrubs with one hand. She looked at Christine. The needle, please. Christine put the 14 gauge in her hand. She turned to Dr. Marcus Webb, the second-year resident who had been standing on the left side of the table this whole time, and had she noted been watching the patient's chest with the specific focus of someone who was starting to understand what he was seeing. Dr. Webb, can you confirm decreased breath, sounds on the left? Webb blinked. He looked at Jones, still standing off balance at the edge of the bay. Then he looked at Miriam. Then he picked up his stethoscope and listened. 4 seconds. 5. Absent breath sounds on the left, he said. His voice was careful and even, like a man stepping onto ice and finding it holds. Trachea is shifted to the right. I think he stopped. She's right. It's a tension pneumo. No one spoke for a moment that felt longer than it was. Walk me through the landmark, Miriam said to Webb, because he needed to do it and she needed him to know he could. She positioned the needle. Second intercostal space midclavicular line. She felt the anatomy under her fingertips the way she had been trained to feel it, the precision of the knowledge residing in her hands as much as her head. Tell me when you are ready to confirm. Ready, Webb said. She advanced the needle. The rush of air that followed was immediate and audible and unmistakable, the release of pressure that had been collapsing the left lung and pushing the heart and great vessels toward the right, dropping the blood pressure, tanking the oxygen saturation, and preparing to kill a man who had come in with every reason to survive. The monitor shifted almost at once. 78, 81, 84. The heart rate began to settle. The patient's color, which had been moving toward a gray that Miriam knew and hated, pulled back towards something closer to human. Webb exhaled. It was shaky and controlled. At once, the sound of someone who understood what had just happened and was still processing that he'd been part of it. Get him stabilized and get thoracic surgery down here, Miriam said. He's going to need a chest tube. She handed the needle to Christine, stripped her gloves, and turned to face the room. Jones had not moved from where he'd ended up, slightly behind and to the left of the trauma cart, his wrist still resting at an odd angle that he was trying not to acknowledge. He was looking at her. Every person in that bay was looking at her. Patricia Owens, the charge nurse who had worked this department for 15 years and thought she had seen everything, was gripping her own clipboard with both hands and breathing through her nose. Miriam looked at the room and then at Jones, not with triumph, not with anger, with the same level unhurried steadiness she'd had since the first moment she told him what she saw. "He's going to live," she said. She picked up her gloves from the tray, dropped them in the waste bin, and walked to the sink to wash her hands. Behind her, the room slowly began to breathe again. Voices resuming, monitors being read, the machinery of medicine recommitting itself to the business of saving a life that was by a margin of minutes and 114-gauge needle still there to be saved. Nobody asked her any questions. Not yet. Nobody quite knew what to say. What had just happened was something that existed in a category that the language of a normal morning hadn't prepared any of them for. Jones left the bay without speaking. His footsteps were deliberate and controlled and told Miriam nothing she didn't already know about him. Webb came to stand beside her at the sink. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water run over her hands. "How did you know?" he said finally, not challenging, genuinely asking. Miriam turned off the faucet and reached for a paper towel. She thought about what to say and how much of it to mean. "I've seen it before," she said. "In an ER." She dried her hands slowly, taking her time with it. "Somewhere else," she said. He waited, but she didn't add anything. She folded the paper towel, dropped it in the bin, and looked at him directly with the kind of look that ends questions without closing the door entirely. "Go write your note," she said. "Be precise. Document the presentation, the intervention, and the patient response. You did good in there." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You did everything." "You confirmed the finding when it mattered," she said. "That took something. Don't minimize it." He nodded slowly, and she could see him deciding to carry that. She walked back out to the floor. The ER had continued its ordinary, extraordinary work around the edges of what had just happened, because that was what ERs did. They did not pause for drama. They did not make room for the weight of any single moment. Somewhere a child was crying. Somewhere a phone was ringing. Somewhere Dana Reyes was explaining a discharge instruction to someone who wasn't listening carefully enough. Miriam went back to her station, picked up her clipboard, and looked at the next name on the list. Gerald Putnam, Bay 4. She had told him she would check back. She always kept her word about that. But as she turned toward Bay 4, Patricia Owens stepped into her path. Patricia was not a woman who dithered. She said what she meant, and she meant it promptly. But right now she was standing with her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a line that was working through something it hadn't finished working through yet. "Miriam," she said. "Patricia, are you all right?" Miriam considered the question with the honest attention it deserved. Her neck was fine. Her hands were steady. She felt, if anything, the particular clarity that followed a moment of absolute necessity, the absence of confusion that came when there was no longer any question of what needed to be done. "I'm fine," she said. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "He grabbed you by the hair." "He did. In front of the entire trauma team." "He did. And you—" Patricia stopped. She uncrossed her arms. "Where did you learn to do that?" "What you did to his wrist." Miriam held her gaze. "I've had a lot of time to practice staying calm," she said. Patricia made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. She shook her head slowly, the way someone shakes their head when they have revised their understanding of something and are still calibrating how large the revision needs to be. "Administration is going to want to talk to you," she said. "I expect so. Jones is going to file something." "He always does." "I expect that too." Patricia looked at her once more, reading whatever it was she was reading. Then she nodded a single definitive nod and stepped aside. Miriam walked to Bay 4. Gerald Putnam was awake, which he shouldn't have been at this hour, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who had heard more of the morning than anyone had intended him to hear. Sound carried differently than people thought in a place where curtains were the primary barrier between spaces. "Heard some commotion," he said. "Trauma came in," she said. "He's stable." Gerald studied her. His eyes were sharp and kind, at once the eyes of someone who had been paying attention to the world for nearly 7 decades and had gotten good at reading the space between what people said and what they meant. "You okay?" he said. "You asked me that before," she said. "Last week when the pediatric code came through." "And what did you say last week?" "I said I was fine." "And were you—" She reached for his chart, more to have something to do with her hands than because she needed the information. "Get some sleep, Gerald." "Miriam." She looked at him. "Whatever happened out there," he said, "I'm glad you were the one in the room." She held the chart against her chest and looked at this man who barely knew her and had somehow in 3 days seen more of her than people she'd worked alongside for years. Sleep, she said again gently. She put the chart back, adjusted the IV bag, checked the monitor reading from habit, and walked back out. Down the hall, past the nurse's station, past the supply room, past the room where she knew without being told that Harrison Jones was making a phone call to someone, and choosing his words carefully, she walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood there for a moment in the early morning light, looking out at a parking lot that was filling up as the day shift arrived, ordinary people with ordinary mornings who had no idea that somewhere in this building, a few minutes ago, a man had put his hands on a woman who was something other than what she appeared to be, and had found that out in a way he would not forget. She breathed in, she breathed out. For a long time, she had worked very hard to be invisible. To be the nurse in the faded scrubs with the worn-out ponytail who was competent and quiet and easy to overlook. She had built that invisibility deliberately brick by brick out of a need for something like peace after years of something that was very far from it. She had chosen this hospital and this role and this version of herself, and she had meant it when she made the choice, and she still meant it now. But she also knew, standing at that window, that something had shifted this morning. Not in who she knew exactly who she was, but in what the people around her were going to be able to see from this point forward. A door had opened that did not easily close again. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she turned around, picked up her clipboard from the windowsill where she'd set it, and went back to work. The call to administration came at 8:43 in the morning, which was faster than Miriam had expected, and exactly as inevitable as she had known it would be. She was in the middle of checking a post-op patient's drain output when Patricia appeared at the curtain with the particular expression of someone delivering news they have complicated feelings about. "Doctor, Calloway wants you in her office," Patricia said. "Now." "How's the patient in Bay 1?" Miriam said, not looking up from the drain. "Webb's with him. Thoracic got the chest tube in. He's moving up to the ICU in 20 minutes. "Good." She noted the output, initialed the chart, and stripped her gloves. "Did Calloway say what it was about?" Patricia gave her a look that said they both knew exactly what it was about. Dr. Ellen Calloway was the chief medical officer of St. Mercy's, a woman in her late 50s, who had spent 30 years in hospital administration, learning how to hold a room without raising her voice. Her office was on the third floor, quiet and orderly, in a way that communicated she did not tolerate chaos anywhere she could control it. She was standing behind her desk when Miriam came in, which told Miriam she had decided to keep this formal. Two other people were in the room. Richard Holt from Human Resources, who was writing something in a folder without looking up, and a woman Miriam didn't recognize sitting in the chair to the left with her hands folded in her lap. "Nurse Gray," Calloway said, "thank you for coming up. Please sit down." Miriam sat. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you are a direct person and I don't want to waste either of our time. I've already spoken with Dr. Jones this morning. I've also spoken with 3 members of the trauma team. I have a fairly complete picture of what happened in Bay 1 approximately 2 hours ago." Calloway paused. "I want to hear it from you." Miriam told her. She told it the same way she would have written it in a report, factual, sequential, without editorializing. The patient's presentation, the clinical signs she observed, the interventions she recommended, Dr. Jones's response to those recommendations, and then what happened after that. She did not minimize the last part, and she did not dramatize it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Richard Holt was still writing. The woman Miriam didn't recognize had not moved. Calloway said, "Dr. Jones has filed a formal complaint alleging that you interfered with his clinical management of a trauma patient and that you committed an act of physical aggression against him." Miriam nodded once. "I expected that. He is also alleging that your intervention was reckless and unauthorized. The patient's oxygen saturation was 78 and dropping when I advanced the needle," Miriam said. "He had absent breath sounds on the left and a deviated trachea. Dr. Webb confirmed both findings. The tension pneumothorax resolved immediately upon decompression, and the patient's vitals stabilized within 90 seconds. He is currently being transferred to the ICU in stable condition." She paused. "I'd call it authorized by the situation." Calloway looked at her steadily. "You understand that performing a needle decompression falls outside the standard scope of nursing practice in this state." "I understand that. And yet you did it." "I did." Calloway was quiet again. She had the stillness of someone who was thinking several things at once and choosing which one to say. "The woman to your left," she said, "is Dr. Sandra Reese. Dr. Reese. She is the head of our Trauma Quality and Patient Safety Committee. She's been reviewing the Bay 1 records since 7 this morning." Miriam looked at Sandra Reese for the first time. Reese was somewhere in her late 40s, with the kind of face that had done a significant amount of serious thinking and showed it in the best possible way. She met Miriam's look with a direct appraising one of her own. "Your clinical read was correct," Reese said. Her voice was measured and certain. A tension pneumothorax of the magnitude indicated by the post-procedure chest imaging would have been fatal within minutes without decompression. The hemorrhage Dr. Jones was managing was real but survivable. The tension pneumo was not. She paused. You saved that man's life. Richard Holt stopped writing. That does not resolve the procedural question, Calloway said carefully. No, Reese agreed, it doesn't, but it is the central clinical fact. Miriam sat with that for a moment. She hadn't needed anyone to tell her. She had known the moment the air hissed through that needle what it meant for the patient for the morning, for all of it. But hearing it said out loud by someone with no stake in protecting her, someone who was simply reading what the data said, settled something in the room. Nurse Greta Calloway said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. All right. Where did you learn to perform that procedure and to do it with that level of confidence? The question sat in the air. Miriam had known it was coming since she walked through the door. She had known it really since the moment she picked up the needle in Bay 1, because some actions are their own introduction, and there is no separating a thing a person does from the question of how they came to be able to do it. She looked at Calloway. Before nursing, she said, I had another career. What kind of career? Military medicine, she said. Special operations. Combat medic attached to a SEAL team. 8 years of active service, 2 in a training and advisory role. The room received this in different ways. Holt looked up from his folder for the first time. Reese's expression didn't change, which told Miriam she was either already informed or very good at not reacting. Calloway's face did something careful and then went still. You were a Navy SEAL, Calloway said. SEAL teams operate with attached combat medics from other branches, Miriam said. I was attached. The distinction matters technically. Practically, I went where they went and did what needed to be done. And what needed to be done, Calloway said slowly, apparently included needle decompressions. Among other things, Miriam said. Yeah? Another silence. This one had a different texture, fuller, heavier, like a room after a window has been opened that has been shut for a long time. Calloway stood very still behind her desk. Then she said, Why didn't we know this? It's not in your personnel file. I didn't put it there. Why not? Miriam looked at her hands for a moment, then back at Calloway. This was the part she never liked explaining, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it was difficult to explain without sounding like something she wasn't damaged or bitter or dramatic about it. She was none of those things. She was simply someone who had made a choice about what she wanted her life to look like and had built it accordingly. When I left the service, she said, I left it. I didn't want to be a combat medic who became a nurse. I wanted to be a nurse. This is my job. This is what I chose. I didn't see any reason to carry the other thing around with me as a credential. Calloway absorbed that. You chose to disappear, she said. I chose to start over, Miriam said. There's a difference. Reese spoke then, leaning slightly forward in her chair. Nurse Gray, in your military service, how many tension pneumothoraces did you decompress in the field? Miriam thought about it. Not because the number was hard to recall, but because calling it up meant calling up the faces attached to it, the conditions, the particular quality of light in places she had not been back, to the weight of a 14-gauge needle, in the same hands that had just used one this morning in a trauma bay, in a hospital, in a city where people had coffee and commutes, and the particular luxury of not knowing what it felt like to make that call in the dark. 11, she said, 2 of them after the administering physician was incapacitated. The room was very quiet. So this morning was not a guess, Reese said. No, Miriam said, it was not a guess. Calloway sat down then slowly as if she needed the chair under her for the next part of her thinking. She laced her fingers together on the desk. Dr. Jones, she said carefully, is a very senior member of this medical staff. He has been with St. Mercy's for 11 years. He has also, in those 11 years, had 3 separate formal complaints filed against him by nursing staff, none of which she added with a precision that told Miriam she was choosing her words for the record as much as for this conversation. You were taken as far as this situation may need to go. That's not why I'm here, Miriam said. I know, Calloway said, but it's relevant. She unclasped her fingers. He put his hands on you, Miriam, in front of witnesses. Whatever the clinical argument is, that piece stands entirely on its own. I know. Do you intend to file a complaint? Miriam considered the question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to be sure it was the right one. She thought about the 13 people who had been standing in Bay 1. She thought about Webb, who had confirmed the finding when it mattered. She thought about Christine, who had put the needle in her hand. She thought about every nurse who had ever been spoken to the way Jones spoke in that room, every person who had swallowed something they shouldn't have had to swallow because the power structure in a hospital was what it was, and filing a complaint was its own kind of cost. I'm going to think about it, she said. Calloway nodded. It was the answer of someone who understood that Miriam was not someone who made decisions in the heat of what she was feeling. There's one more thing, Calloway said. She opened the folder in front of her and slid a single sheet across the desk. I want you to look at this. Miriam picked it up. It was a proposal. She read it quickly and then read it again more slowly, which was the reading it deserved. It was an offer, a formal proposal for a newly created position, Clinical Lead Advanced Trauma Response. The language was careful and new, the kind of language that gets written around something that doesn't have established language yet. The responsibilities were a hybrid part, senior nursing lead, part clinical education, part trauma protocol development. The compensation was significantly above her current rate. There was a note in the margin in pen that said in Calloway's handwriting, "Your name was my first thought." Miriam set the paper down. That's not a response to this morning, Calloway said. I want to be very clear about that. I've been aware for several months that we have a gap in our trauma response capability at the nursing level. This morning confirmed it in a way that I can no longer put in a drawer and revisit later. This offer would have come to you eventually. It comes to you today because today removed any doubt about the timeline. Miriam looked at the paper. She looked at her own hands. She thought about Gerald Putnam in Bay 4, who had said he was glad she was the one in the room, and about Dana Reyes, who still flinched slightly when a trauma came in hot, and about Webb, who had confirmed the finding and needed someone to tell him that mattered. I'd like some time, she said. Of course, Calloway said. A few days. Take the week. Miriam stood. She picked up nothing from the desk because she had brought nothing with her. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Calloway." And she meant it not effusively, but genuinely the way she meant most things. She was almost at the door when Calloway said, "Miriam." She turned. Dr. Jones is currently in a meeting with legal counsel and 2 members of the board. Calloway's voice was even. I want you to know that the 3 members of the trauma team I spoke to this morning all gave the same account. Independently. Word for word, essentially, on the substantive facts. She paused. Whatever he tries to build a foundation isn't there. Miriam held her gaze. The patient is stable, she said. That's the foundation. She walked out. The elevator back to the ER was empty, which she was grateful for. She stood in it for 15 floors with her back against the wall and her eyes on the middle distance and let herself do the things she never did in front of anyone, which was feel the weight of the morning without managing it. It was a lot of weight. Not bad weight, not all of it, but weight the same way any significant thing is heavy, not because it's destroying you, but because you are genuinely carrying it and your body knows the difference between that and putting it down. The doors opened on the ER floor and she walked back into the noise and the pace and the particular smell of a hospital at full daytime function. Antiseptic and coffee and someone's lunch from the break room down the hall. And within 30 seconds, Dana Reyes was at her elbow with a chart and an update and a question about a patient in Bay 7, and Miriam answered all 3 and was already moving before the last word was out. This was what she was good at. Not the other thing, not the needle and the combat knowledge and the 11 cases in the field. This, the pace, the knowing where to be and what was needed and how to read a room full of people who were all trying to do the right thing in the wrong amount of time with the wrong amount of information. She had built this skill on top of everything else she had ever known, and it was the one she wanted to keep using. She was checking a patient's medication log when she heard Jones's voice. He was at the end of the corridor near the attending lounge talking to someone she couldn't see. His voice was low and controlled and had the texture of a man reconstructing himself in real time, choosing words for a narrative. She could hear him without being able to make out the specific words, which was almost worse, the shape of damage control, without the detail. Then Dr. Webb came around the corner from the other direction and nearly walked into her. Oh, sorry, Miriam. He stopped. He looked like he had covered a large amount of ground in a short time and had something to say at the end of it. Have you talked to Calloway? Just came from there. Okay. He exhaled. Okay. I want you to know, I gave my account this morning. Everything exactly as it happened. I didn't soften it. I know, she said. How do you know? Because Calloway told me 3 accounts were consistent, and I know what Christine would have said, so the 3rd one was yours. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that? Yeah, he said, with the firmness of someone who has already argued this point with himself and arrived at a conclusion. I did. She nodded. There was a version of this moment where she told him what that kind of integrity cost a junior resident in a hospital where a senior surgeon had just been humiliated and was looking for the geography of the landscape for where the soft ground was. But Webb already knew. The fact that he had told the truth anyway was not ignorance of the pity. It was a decision made with full knowledge of it. Go eat something, she said instead. You look like you've been running since 6. I have been running since 6. Food helps. He almost smiled. Is that a medical recommendation? It's a human one, she said. They're sometimes the same thing. He went and she turned back to the medication log, and the ER continued around her at its own unrelenting pace. The next few hours had the quality of a day that has already said the most dramatic thing it has to say, and is now managing the aftermath at volume. Two new traumas came in: a construction worker with a crush injury and a woman in her 70s who had fallen at home and broken her hip. Neither was uncomplicated. Both required the kind of sustained, focused attention that left no room for anything that wasn't directly in front of her. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. It was nearly noon when Christine appeared beside her at the supply station, refilling the same cart she always refilled at the same time every shift, and did not say anything for a moment, just worked alongside her in the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and haven't decided yet how to talk about it. "You okay?" Christine said finally. "People keep asking me that today," Miriam said. "People keep meaning it." Miriam handed her a box of gauze without being asked. "I'm okay." Christine took the gauze, paused. "I've been here 11 years, she said. "I've seen Jones do a lot of things. I have never," she stopped, started again. "When he grabbed you, I thought I didn't know what I thought. I didn't know what was going to happen." "Nothing happened to me," Miriam said. "No," Christine was quiet for a second. "Something happened to him." Miriam didn't say anything. "I put that needle in your hand," Christine said. "I want you to know I would do it again. Whatever comes from today, I would do it again." Miriam looked at her. Christine was not a woman who made declarations easily. This one had been weighed before it was offered. "Thank you," Miriam said. Christine nodded briskly, the nod of someone who has said what they came to say and is returning to work. She pushed the cart down the hall and was gone. Miriam stood at the supply station for a moment. Outside the window at the end of the hall, the parking lot was full and ordinary in the way that the middle of a Tuesday is: ordinary people going places, not knowing what had happened in a room in this building this morning, not knowing that a man had put his hands on a woman and found out something that changed everyone who witnessed it. She thought about Calloway's offer. She thought about what it would mean to take it, not the logistics, not the title, but what it would mean in the larger sense. She had spent 3 years building invisibility at St. Mercy's, making herself useful without making herself noticed. She had done that on purpose, and she had been content with it. But there was something shifting this morning that she could not unshift, and she was honest enough with herself to know that the question was not whether to accept the visibility, but what to do with it now that it was here. She was still holding that thought when her pager went off. She looked down at it. The number was Patricia Owens, not a patient call, Patricia's own extension. She went to the nearest phone and called back. "Jones just left the building," Patricia said without preamble. His assistant cleared his afternoon schedule. Word from up top is the board meeting ran long and didn't end the way he expected it to. "That's between him and the board," Miriam said. "Sure," Patricia said, "but there's something else." A pause. "His lawyer called the floor 20 minutes ago, asked for you by name. Wanted to know if you'd be willing to speak with them informally before any formal process begins." Miriam said nothing. "I told them you were with a patient," Patricia said. "Which you were. You're always with a patient." "What's the informal conversation supposed to accomplish?" Miriam said. "Best guess, they want to see what you're made of before they decide how hard to push." Miriam stood with the phone pressed to her ear and thought about what they would find if they looked. 11 field decompressions. 8 years in places where the concept of informal conversation had a very different meaning. A 14-gauge needle at 8 in the morning in a room full of witnesses. A patient alive in the ICU because of a decision made in under 4 seconds. "Tell them I'll be available at the end of my shift," she said. "Which is 7. "Okay." Patricia was quiet for a beat. "Miriam, whatever they're hoping to find when they sit down with you." "They're going to find a nurse," Miriam said. "Who did her job." She hung up the phone, turned around, and walked back into the ER. The lawyer's name was David Kaufman, and he arrived at St. Mercy's at 6:58 in the evening, 2 minutes before Miriam's shift technically ended, which told her something about how he operated. He was waiting in the small conference room off the main lobby when Patricia walked her down, a trim man in his mid-40s with a leather portfolio and the practiced ease of someone who spent his professional life in rooms where the outcome had not yet been decided. He stood when she came in, which she noted. He extended his hand, which she shook. "Nurse Gray, thank you for making time." "My shift ended at 7, she said. "I have time." He smiled at that, a real smile, not a performance of one. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat, and he sat, and Patricia closed the door from the outside, which meant she was standing in the hallway on the other side of it, which Miriam appreciated more than she would say. "I want to be honest with you about why I'm here," Kaufman said. "That would be a good start," she said. He opened the portfolio without looking at it. "Dr. Jones has retained my firm to advise him on his options following this morning's events. I have reviewed the incident reports, the patient record, and the accounts of 6 staff members. He paused. I have also had a conversation with Dr. Sandra Reese, which was not what my client anticipated when he suggested I reach out to the clinical review team. Miriam waited. I'm not here to threaten you, Kaufman said. I want to be direct about that. My client's position is significantly more complicated than he understood it to be when he called my office at 9 this morning. He turned a page in the portfolio without reading it. A patient survived because of a clinical decision you made. That is not a fact my client can argue around, and I would not advise him to try. Then what are you here for, Miriam said. To understand what you want, Kaufman said. She looked at him. He was not being dishonest. She could read dishonesty the way some people read weather from small changes in pressure that most people didn't notice. He was being careful, which was different. He was a careful man doing a careful job for a client who had put himself in an indefensible position, and he was trying to find the narrowest path through it that didn't take everyone down. I want to do my job, Miriam said. I've been doing it since 6 this morning. I'd like to keep doing it. Has Dr. Calloway spoken to you about your continued employment? She has. And the matter of Dr. Jones's complaint against you. I'm aware of it. Kaufman nodded slowly. My client's complaint in its current form alleges unauthorized clinical intervention and physical aggression. He said it flatly, not as advocacy, as a recitation of something he was obligated to name. I think you and I both know what the evidence does to those allegations when it's laid out in full. I think we do, Miriam said, which means that complaint, if pursued, becomes a document that the hospital's legal team will meet with the patient record, 6 witness statements, and a post-procedure imaging report. Much shows a resolved tension pneumothorax. He paused. It would not go well for my client. That's between your client and the truth, Miriam said. Kaufman looked at her for a moment. You're not angry, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm something, she said. Anger's not the most useful version of it. What would you call the most useful version? She thought about that. Clarity, she said. I'm very clear. He wrote something in his portfolio. She didn't try to see what it was. Nurse Gray, I'm going to ask you directly whether you intend to pursue a formal complaint against Dr. Jones for the physical contact that occurred this morning. I'm going to answer you directly, she said. I haven't decided. What would help you decide, knowing that what happened this morning doesn't happen to the next person, she said, or the one after that? Kaufman was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone recalibrating, not because he was surprised, but because the conversation had just clarified something he had needed clarified. That's a structural concern, he said. Yes. Not a personal one. It's both, she said, but the structural one is the one that matters past today. He closed the portfolio. He did not stand yet, but the conversation had shifted into its final register. I'll relay that, he said. For what it's worth, my professional advice to my client, which I will give him again tonight, is that his most viable path forward is one that does not involve this hospital's emergency department, this patient's outcome, or your professional history as contested facts in any public record. I'm not interested in public records, Miriam said. I'm interested in what changes. Then I think, Kaufman said carefully, we may not be as far apart as my client hoped. She stood. He stood. She shook his hand again, and this time the handshake had the particular quality of something that had been negotiated and received without anyone saying so explicitly, which was its own kind of language. She walked out of the conference room, and Patricia fell into step beside her without a word, which was how Miriam knew Patricia had been listening through the door and had the decency not to pretend otherwise. They walked the length of the lobby before either of them spoke. How did that feel? Patricia said. Like a conversation that's going to have consequences I can't fully predict, Miriam said, which is most conversations. Patricia made a sound that landed somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Go home, Miriam. You've had a day. I need to check on Gerald first. Gerald Putnam is asleep. I checked an hour ago. I'll still stop by. Patricia looked at her sideways. Do you ever actually leave? I leave, Miriam said. I just leave last. Gerald was asleep, as Patricia had said, his breathing even, and his face relaxed in the uncomplicated way of someone who had made peace with the particular helplessness of being a patient and had surrendered to it as productively as possible. His labs, she could see from the monitor, data had come back favorable. The infection was responding to the antibiotics. He would very likely go home tomorrow, which she was glad about because Gerald was not a man who belonged in a hospital bed, and they both knew it. She stood at the edge of his bay for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she straightened the edge of his blanket, not because it needed straightening, but because the gesture was the small, ordinary human act that cost nothing and meant everything to someone lying in a place where they felt temporarily outside their own life. She was in the parking lot, her bag on her shoulder, and the night air finally cool against her face when her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize. She stood beside her car and answered it. Is this Miriam Gray? The voice was a woman's, low and steady, with a quality Miriam had learned to place across a decade, the voice of someone who had been trained to stay calm when the situation was not. It is, Miriam said. My name is Commander Rachel Yates. I'm with Naval Special Warfare Command Public Affairs Division. A pause. I know this is out of nowhere. I apologize for calling on your personal line. Miriam stood very still. The parking lot was quiet around her, a few cars passing on the road beyond the fence, the lights of the hospital behind her casting long shadows across the asphalt. How did you get this number? She said. Your situation came to our attention this afternoon, Yates said. There's been some press interest. In what kind of press interest? The kind that starts with a hospital source and ends with a reporter asking whether a decorated Navy combat medic performed emergency surgery in an ER this morning. Yates's voice was measured and even, which was exactly the tone a person used when delivering news they knew was going to land badly. A story is being prepared. Our office was contacted for comment approximately 2 hours ago. Miriam closed her eyes. She opened them. The parking lot was still there. The night air was still cool. 11 field decompressions in 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility, and it was a hospital source and a reporter who was going to undo it. Not anything she had done. Someone else's decision about what to do with the thing they had witnessed. What are they saying? She said. The headline as it was described to us is something along the lines of former Navy SEAL saves life after surgeon's assault. Yates paused. It's not inaccurate exactly, but it's a version, Miriam said. Yes, Yates agreed. Our office is not going to comment without your input. We wanted to reach you first. You have the right to manage your own narrative, Nurse Gray. You've earned that right several times over. Miriam stood with the phone pressed to her ear and thought about what Rachel Yates couldn't know about the specific shape of the life she had built at St. Mercy's, the deliberate smallness of it, the way she had chosen to be known by what she did rather than what she had done. She thought about Gerald Putnam asking whether she had been military and how she had answered without answering. She thought about Webb asking how she knew and how she had said somewhere else. She thought about 3 years of faded scrubs and early mornings and a ponytail that had seen better days. What's the publication? She said. Yates told her it was not a small outlet. When are they running it? Tomorrow morning unless something changes. Miriam leaned against her car. The metal was cool against her back. She looked up at the sky, which was doing the thing it did in late spring, going dark at the edges, while the center held a little longer, a brief negotiation between the day and the night. She had had days like that. She had been the center, holding a little longer while the dark came in from the edges. She had learned that the dark was not the problem. The problem was thinking you could stop it. Tell your office not to comment, she said. I'll handle it. How? I'll speak with the reporter directly, she said. Tonight if possible. A pause. Are you sure that's the approach you want to take? I'm sure that's the approach I'm going to take, she said, which is the same thing for me. Yates gave her the reporter's contact information and ended the call with the careful professionalism of someone who had respect for the woman on the other end of the line and the good sense not to say so when it wasn't asked for. Miriam stood in the parking lot for another minute. Then she called the number. The reporter's name was James Callum. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. Mr. Callum, she said, this is Miriam Gray. I understand you're working on a story. A beat of silence, brief and electric, the sound of someone who had not expected his subject to call him directly. Nurse Gray, yes, I was going to reach out to you tomorrow morning. I'm available now, she said. I'd prefer to do this now. Of course. She heard him moving, the sound of a chair, a door closing. The shuffling of someone getting organized faster than they expected to need to. I want to say up front that I'm not trying to ambush you. The story is being written regardless of whether you speak with me, but I'd rather have your account in it than not. I know, she said. That's why I called. Okay. A pause. Can I ask, how did you know we were working on it? I have people who tell me things, she said, which was true if by people she meant Commander Rachel Yates, and if by things she meant the specific thing that mattered, which she did. Can I record this call? Yes, she heard the soft click of a recording app starting. Nurse Gray, can you walk me through what happened in the trauma bay at St. Mercy's this morning? And she told it again, the same way she had told it to Calloway, factual and sequential and without editorializing. She told him about the patient in the saturation and the deviated trachea. She told him about recommending the airway assessment and being dismissed. She told him about the monitor reading 78 in the needle and the rush of air and the stabilizing vitals. She did not tell it the way a headline wanted it told. She told it the way it happened. And the physical confrontation with Dr. Jones, Callum said. He grabbed my hair, she said. I removed his hand. I continued treating the patient. That's a fairly spare account of what multiple witnesses described as a significant incident. It was significant, she said. It was also brief. I had a patient in respiratory arrest. The timeline didn't allow for more than brief. Fair enough, she heard him writing. Can you tell me about your military service? I served 8 years, she said. Combat medic attached to special operations. I deployed several times. I did the job I was trained to do. Why did you leave? She had expected the question. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, not by scripting an answer, but by deciding how much of the truth she was willing to offer and where the line was. Personal reasons, she said, which I'm keeping personal. Well, why nursing after that kind of service? Because nursing is how I help people now, she said. The choice wasn't complicated. I wanted to take care of people in a context where taking care of them was the whole job, not one part of a larger objective, the whole thing. Callum was quiet for a moment. You've spent 3 years at St. Mercy's without anyone knowing your background. That was deliberate, she said. Why pie? Because I wasn't my background, she said. I was the nurse on the floor. That's what I wanted to be. That's what I was. Was, he said, catching it. That's still what I am, she said. What's changed is that other people know more about the context. The job is the same. Dr. Jones has filed a complaint against you, Callum said. I'm aware. Do you have a response to the allegations of unauthorized clinical intervention? The patient is alive, she said. That's my response. And the allegation of physical aggression. He put his hand on me, she said. I removed it. Any reasonable person can decide what to call that. Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him working through how to ask the next thing. Nurse Gray, the version of this story that's going to run tomorrow, I want to be honest with you about what it looks like. Former Navy SEAL saves life after surgeon's assault. That's the frame. My editor is committed to that frame. I know, she said. Does that bother you? She thought about it. The honest answer was that it bothered her the way most simplifications bothered her, not because they were wrong, but because they were thin. A frame like that turned a morning of clinical decisions and human complexity into something that fit on a screen for 30 seconds. It turned her into a type. She had spent 3 years actively avoiding becoming a type. What would help me, she said, is if the story also said that a second-year resident named Marcus Webb confirmed the clinical finding when it mattered, and that a nurse named Christine, I'll get you her last name, put a needle in my hand when she didn't have to. Because the story that actually matters is that a team of people did the right thing under pressure. I was part of that team. I wasn't the whole thing. Callum stopped writing. She could feel it through the phone, the specific quality of a pause that means someone has just heard something they weren't expecting. I can do that, he said quietly. Then we're good, she said. She hung up and got in her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment without starting the engine. The hospital lights were behind her, and the road ahead was dark and ordinary, the kind of dark that was just night and nothing more. Not the other kind, not the kind she had driven through in vehicles without names and places, without addresses, on her way to do things that couldn't be written in a report. This was just Tuesday night. She was just a woman in a parking lot at the end of a long shift. She drove home. Her apartment was the kind of apartment that belonged to someone who had learned to live without accumulation. A few pieces of furniture that served their function, without decoration books organized by the frequency. She returned to them, a kitchen that showed evidence of actual cooking, a window that looked out on a street with enough foot traffic to feel connected to the world without being inside it. She had made it comfortable the way she made most things efficiently, without fuss, with attention to what actually mattered. She changed out of her scrubs and made tea and stood at the window while it steeped, watching the street below. A couple walked past, arguing about something domestic and low stakes. A dog pulled its owner towards something interesting on the sidewalk. A delivery person checked their phone and turned left. The world at 9:15 on a Tuesday night, going about its business. She thought about what tomorrow would look like. The story would run. People would read it. Someone at the hospital would see it before she arrived, and the day would begin differently than her days had begun for 3 years. She had known standing in that parking lot talking to Yates that this was the new shape of things and that she could manage it, but she could not prevent it. She thought about Calloway's offer, the clinical lead position, the gap in trauma response capability, the note in the margin in pen. She had told herself she needed a week. She was beginning to think she didn't need a week. She was beginning to think she had known since she read the proposal what she was going to do, the same way she had known since she picked up the 14-gauge needle what the outcome was going to be. Not with certainty, but with the particular confidence of someone who had made enough decisions under real pressure to trust the read. Her phone rang. She looked at it. It was Webb. She answered. I hope I'm not calling too late, he said. You're not, she said. I saw something. He paused. Someone posted about it from the ER. About this morning. There are a lot of comments. I know, she said. Are you okay with that? She turned away from the window. I'm working on okay, she said. How are you? Honestly, I've been thinking about this morning for 12 straight hours and I still can't. There's something I need to ask you. Go ahead. In the bay, he said. When you were standing there and Jones was when he was ordering you out. You didn't move, you didn't back down, and you didn't escalate. You just stayed. He stopped. How do you do that? How do you hold still in the middle of something like that? Miriam thought about how to answer that honestly. She had been asked versions of it before in different contexts by different people who had seen her operate in moments that required a kind of stillness that didn't come naturally to most. You practice it, she said. What stillness, exactly? You practice knowing the difference between what's urgent and what's loud. A lot of things in a crisis are loud. Very few of them are the actual emergency. If you can train yourself to find the actual emergency and focus there, the loud stuff becomes background. That sounds like something you learned somewhere specific, he said. It is, she said. He didn't push, which told her he had the same kind of intelligence she'd been watching all day, the kind that knew when a door was closed and had the grace not to knock. Get some sleep, Webb, she said. Yeah, a pause. Miriam, thank you for today, for what you said about the note. I'm going to write the best note of my residency. I know you are, she said. Good night. She set the phone down on the table and picked up her tea and held the warmth of the mug between both hands, the way she sometimes did when the day had been large and she needed something small and certain to hold on to. Tomorrow the story would run. Tomorrow people would know her name in a different way. Tomorrow Calloway would likely call, and Kaufman's client would make a decision, and the board would take a position, and the ordinary, extraordinary machine of a hospital would continue its work with or without any of the drama that had surrounded it today. And tomorrow she would put on her faded blue scrubs, pull her hair back in a ponytail that had seen better days, walk into St. Mercy's 13 minutes before her shift, and go check on Gerald Putnam in Bay 4 because she had told him she would be there, and she kept her word about that. That hadn't changed. None of the things that actually mattered about her had changed. She knew what she was. She had always known. The question that was waiting for her at the beginning of tomorrow, the one she had been circling all day without landing on, settled into its final form as she stood at the window with her tea going cool in her hands. It was not whether to accept the visibility. It was what to build with it. She thought she was starting to know the answer. The story ran at 6:47 in the morning. Miriam knew the exact time because she was already in her car 13 minutes from the hospital when her phone started moving on the passenger seat with the particular restless energy of something that has been activated and is not going to stop. She didn't touch it. She kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road and let it go because she had made her decisions last night and the decisions were made and there was nothing in that phone that was going to change the next hour except her ability to walk into it clearly. She parked. She picked up the phone. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, 2 voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize, 1 text from Commander Yates that said simply, "It's running. Call me when you can." 1 text from Webb that said, "Saw it. You okay?" 1 text from a number she hadn't saved in 3 years that stopped her breathing for a full 4 seconds. The text from the unsaved number said, "Heard what happened. Proud of you, Gray. Kowalski." She sat with that for a moment. Staff Sergeant Daniel Kowalski, who had been her team's senior medic for 4 of her 8 years, who had taught her the pressure point technique she had used on Jones's wrist, who had been the first person to tell her she had the hands and the mind for this work when she had been 26 years old and uncertain of almost everything. He had found her number, which meant he had seen the story, which meant the story had traveled somewhere she had not fully anticipated. She put the phone in her bag and got out of the car. The ER entrance was the same as every morning. The automatic doors, the antiseptic smell, the low hum of a place that does not stop for night or weather or any personal drama occurring in the wider world. Dana Reyes was at the nurse's station, and when she looked up and saw Miriam coming through the doors, something moved across her face that was not her usual expression. Not alarm. Something closer to the look a person gets when something they had heard about has just walked into the room and confirmed itself. "Good morning," Miriam said. "Good morning," Dana said. Then after a beat, "My mom called me at 6:30 this morning." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "She read the article," Dana said. "She asked me if I knew you. I said yes." She said, and I quote, "Dana, you work with a hero." She paused. "I told her you were going to hate that." "I do hate that," Miriam said. "I know," Dana said. "I told her that too." Miriam almost smiled. She picked up the overnight report and started moving through it, and Dana fell into step beside her in the way she had been doing for months, which meant she had something more to say and was finding the right moment for it. "There are 2 people in the waiting room," Dana said. They've been there since 6. They say they're not patients. Miriam kept reading. Reporters. One of them identified himself as a photographer. The other one didn't identify herself as anything. She said she'd wait until you came in. Miriam set the report down on the counter. What does she look like? 50s maybe. Very straight posture. Short hair. She's been sitting completely still for 40 minutes, which honestly is more impressive than anything else this morning. Miriam knew before she turned the corner. She knew the way she sometimes knew things not from logic, not from evidence, but from the part of her that had been trained to read situations before they completed themselves, the part that processed posture and stillness and the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to waiting without fidgeting because they had done real waiting in real circumstances. The woman in the waiting room was in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair, cut close, and eyes that were taking in the room with a systematic thoroughness that was not hostility, but was very much assessment. She was wearing civilian clothes, but they sat on her the way civilian clothes sat on certain people. Adequately, like a costume that fit, but was not the point. She stood when she saw Miriam coming. Not quickly, with a controlled economy of someone who had spent a long time calibrating movement. Nurse Gray, she said. You're not press, Miriam said. No. The woman extended her hand. Captain Louise Hargrove, Navy Medicine. I drove up from Norfolk this morning. Miriam shook her hand. She felt the grip. She registered what it meant. She said, you could have called. I wanted to have this conversation in person, Hargrove said. Some conversations don't work on the phone. Miriam looked at her steadily. What conversation are we having? Hargrove glanced once at the photographer sitting across the waiting room, who was doing a creditable impression of someone absorbed in his phone. Is there somewhere more private? They used the small family consultation room off the main corridor. It was a room that held hard news. On most days, Miriam knew its specific silence, the weight it carried from everything it had absorbed over the years. She sat across from Hargrove and waited with her hands folded on the table. I read the article this morning, Hargrove said. Before that, I received a call yesterday afternoon from Commander Yates in Public Affairs. Before that, a name came across my desk 2 days ago in a context I can't fully detail, but which involved a DOD-level review of combat medical protocols and the people who shaped them. She paused. Your name, Nurse Gray, in a context that had nothing to do with what happened in that trauma bay yesterday. Miriam went still. The review, Hargrove continued, is looking at advanced trauma response protocols developed during operations in which you participated, specifically the field adaptations your team made to standard decompression procedure under austere conditions. 3 of those adaptations have since been incorporated into Navy medical training. 2 more are under current consideration. She looked at Miriam directly. You developed those adaptations. I was part of the team that developed them, Miriam said. Your documentation was the basis, Hargrove said. Your field notes, your after-action medical reports. I've read them. All of them. Miriam said nothing. She had written those reports at field tables in places with no reliable light, after shifts that lasted as long as the situation required, with the particular discipline of someone who understood that the next medic in a similar situation would need to know what she had learned. She had never thought of them as anything beyond that. What does this have to do with what happened yesterday, Miriam said. On its own, nothing, Hargrove said. But here is what has happened in the last 18 hours. An article has been published describing a decorated Navy combat medic performing a life-saving procedure in a civilian emergency room after being physically assaulted by the supervising physician. That article has been read by a significant number of people. My phone has been active since 5 this morning. She paused. The Navy is going to respond to this, Nurse Gray. Not because we're looking for publicity, because the people at the top of this organization understand that what happened in that room yesterday is in some direct way a result of what we trained you to do and how we trained you to do it. Miriam looked at her. What kind of response? Hargrove folded her hands on the table. There are people who want to use this moment, she said carefully, to make an argument about the deployment of combat-trained medical personnel in civilian healthcare systems. There are others who want to make a different argument entirely about the treatment of women in high-stakes medical environments. She paused. And there are people, including some I work with closely, who simply want to recognize that a person who served this country with distinction is still serving in a different way, and that what she did yesterday is consistent with everything she was. Miriam absorbed that. And what do you want? She said. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I want to know what you want. Because everything that happens next, the Navy's response, the public conversation, the conversations being had in hospital systems across this country right now about what yesterday means, all of that is going to be shaped by what you say and what you choose to do. She leaned forward slightly. You spoke to the reporter last night and you made it about the team. I read that in the article, and I thought she understands exactly what she's doing. I understand what I was doing, Miriam said. I'm less certain about what other people are going to do with it. That's the honest position, Hargrove said. It's the only position I have. Hargrove reached into the bag she'd set on the table and produced a single envelope, which she placed between them without pushing it forward. This is formal. You don't have to take it now. You don't have to take it at all. But I was asked to deliver it in person, which is why I drove up at 4 in the morning. She looked at Miriam. It's a request for you to speak at the Naval Medical Center's annual trauma symposium in September. As the keynote on advanced trauma response in austere environments in the translation of combat medicine to civilian practice. Miriam looked at the envelope. The audience would be military medical personnel and civilian trauma staff, Hargrove said, approximately 400 people. The talk would be recorded and incorporated into our advanced training curriculum. The room was very quiet. Miriam could hear the distant sounds of the ER going about its business on the other side of the walls, the rhythm she had built her days around, the sound that had become the background of the life she had rebuilt. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of 400 people and be explicitly and publicly the person she had spent 3 years not being in any visible way. She thought about Webb asking how she had known. She thought about what she had told him, that you practice finding the actual emergency inside the noise. She thought about 11 field decompressions and a team of people who had learned what she learned at the same cost she had paid and had gone on to teach it to the next group who would need it. She thought about what she had been circling last night at her window with her tea going cold, what to build with it. I'll read it, she said and picked up the envelope. Hargrove nodded. She stood and Miriam stood, and they shook hands again, and this time the handshake was something that had been considered and arrived at, not just concluded. She walked Hargrove back to the lobby and watched her go through the automatic doors and into the morning. And then she turned around to find Patricia Owens standing 6 feet behind her with a coffee in each hand and an expression that said she had seen enough of this morning to need the caffeine and the information in equal measure. Was that military? Patricia said. Yes, Miriam said. Patricia handed her a coffee. Of course it was. She looked at the envelope in Miriam's hand. Good news or complicated news? Complicated news that might be good, Miriam said. That's most news, Patricia said. They walked back to the floor together, and the morning resumed its pace because the morning did not wait and never had, and Miriam had always been grateful for that. The patient from Bay 1, the motorcyclist whose name she had since learned, was Tyler Marsh. 34 years old and an electrician from a suburb 40 minutes north, had been moved to the ICU in the night. He was stable and breathing on his own with the assistance that a chest tube required, which was given where he had been at 8 yesterday morning, a state of affairs that bordered on extraordinary. His wife had been in the ICU waiting room overnight. Miriam knew because the night shift charge nurse had left a note. She had not planned to go up there. It wasn't her unit. It wasn't her patient post-transfer, and the clinical relationship was technically over. But she had a free window at 10:15, and she took the elevator to the 4th floor, and she walked to the waiting room, and she found a woman in her early 30s sitting with a paper coffee cup in both hands, her eyes the particular raw red of someone who had cried through the night and come out the other side. She looked up when Miriam came in. Mrs. Marsh, Miriam said. Yes. I'm Miriam Gray. I was the charge nurse in the trauma bay when your husband came in yesterday morning. The woman's face did something complicated. You're the one, she said, the nurse in the article. I was one of several people who treated your husband, Miriam said. You saved his life. Her voice was steady but cost something to keep that way. We saved his life, Miriam said. Your husband was in a room full of people who were all working to bring him back. I made one decision that mattered. The rest of the team made 20 others. Mrs. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. I kept thinking last night, I kept thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Or if you had been there and you hadn't, if you hadn't said something. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, I'm very tired. Don't apologize, Miriam said. You're allowed to be tired. She exhaled. Is he really going to be okay? His chart this morning shows significant improvement, Miriam said. He has a good team on the 4th floor. You should talk to them about specifics, but from where he was yesterday morning to where he is right now, that's a man who is fighting. Mrs. Marsh put the coffee cup down on the table beside her and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, exactly doing the thing people did when the adrenaline finally released and the body needed somewhere to put all the weight it had been carrying. Miriam sat down in the chair beside her, not touching her just there, which was what the moment asked for. After a minute, the woman lifted her head. Thank you, she said. I don't know what else to say. I know that's not enough. It's enough, Miriam said, and she meant it. She took the elevator back down to the ER. Jones's office was dark when she passed it, which she had expected. His assistant's desk was occupied by a temporary admin who was answering calls with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed on a situation without being given all the details. Miriam did not slow her pace. Whatever was happening in those administrative layers, the board, the legal teams, the formal processes that had been set in motion was happening in its own time and on its own logic, and she had said what she had to say to the people she needed to say it to. The call from Calloway came at 11:22. "Can you come up?" Calloway said. "No preamble this time. Just you. Now, if possible." "Give me 10 minutes," Miriam said. She was there in 8. Calloway was alone in her office. No Holt, no Reese, no second chairs occupied. She was standing at the window when Miriam came in, which was different from yesterday, and she turned when she heard the door and looked at Miriam with an expression that had moved past the careful professionalism of the previous day into something more direct. "I've had 14 calls this morning from hospital administrators at other institutions," Calloway said. 3 from medical school department heads, 1 from a state health commissioner's office, and 1 from a journalist who is not the same journalist who published this morning's piece, who is working on a longer profile." She paused. "About you." Miriam sat down without being invited. "I didn't ask for any of that." "I know you didn't," Calloway said. "That's what makes it harder to manage." She moved from the window to behind her desk, which was the formal position, but her posture was not formal in the way it had been yesterday. It was the posture of someone who has been running fast all morning and has just sat down. Dr. Jones tendered his resignation this morning, effective immediately. The air in the room shifted. Miriam said nothing for a moment. "That was his choice," she said. "His lawyer's recommendation," Calloway said. "The board meeting yesterday combined with the article and then the board meeting this morning, which ran until 10, the picture became very clear very fast. He could resign or he could face a formal review with 6 witness statements in a dead patient's chart in front of him." She paused. "He resigned." Miriam thought about Jones in that bay, the absolute certainty he'd worn like his immaculate white coat, the 19 years of unchallenged authority that had made reaching for a nurse's hair feel like a viable response to disagreement. She thought about what the 3 previous complaints had not done, that one morning had done in the space of a few hours, and she thought about what that said about which stories got told and who had to tell them before anyone listened. "I'm not satisfied," she said, and Calloway looked at her. "I'm not satisfied that he resigned. I'm satisfied that he's gone. Those are different things." "I know," Calloway said quietly. "The 3 nurses who filed complaints before me," Miriam said. "What happened to them?" Calloway held her gaze. It was a question that had weight, and they both knew it. 2 are still on staff," she said. "1 transferred to another facility 18 months ago." "I'd like to talk to the 2 who are still here," Miriam said. "At some point, when they're comfortable." Calloway nodded slowly. "I'll make that possible." She reached for the folder on her desk. "I'm also formally withdrawing the procedural concern about the needle decompression." Dr. Reese's committee completed its review at 8 this morning. The finding is that the intervention was clinically justified by the patient's condition and the available evidence at the time. It's been entered into the record. Miriam absorbed that. "Good," she said. "There's one more thing." Calloway opened the folder and produced a document that was not the same proposal from yesterday. It was longer. Miriam read the title and looked up. "That's a different position than what you offered me yesterday," she said. "It is," Calloway said. "The board authorized this morning. It's a newly created department-level role, Director of Trauma Nursing Excellence. You would set clinical standards, lead training protocols, and have direct input into hiring and credentialing decisions for the nursing staff in emergency and trauma. You would also retain a clinical role if you chose to. We're not pulling you off the floor, because I think we both know you wouldn't take it if we did." She paused. "The compensation is significantly higher than yesterday's offer." Miriam held the document. She felt the weight of it, not the paper, but what it represented. She thought about the things she had said to Kaufman's lawyer about wanting structural change, not personal resolution. She thought about Webb needing someone to tell him his confirmation mattered. She thought about Dana Reyes, who still flinched at a hot trauma. She thought about the nurse who had transferred 18 months ago. She thought about what she had wanted when she had walked away from the battlefield and found her way to a floor in this hospital in faded blue scrubs. She had wanted to take care of people. She had wanted the whole job to be that. She had wanted to be useful in a place where useful was enough. The job in front of her was still that. It was also more. It was the opportunity to make that possible for other people to build from the inside the kind of environment where a nurse who saw something critical could say it once and be heard, where the difference between a patient living and dying wasn't also the difference between whether someone in authority felt challenged. She set the document on the desk. "I'll take it," she said. Calloway exhaled. Not with relief exactly, with something that recognized the weight of the decision and treated it accordingly. I'm glad, she said. I want to be clear, this isn't a transaction. This isn't the hospital buying your silence or managing the optics. We have a real problem in this institution, and you are the most qualified person I have found in 15 years of administration to help us address it. I know, Miriam said. That's why I said yes. She stood. Miriam. Calloway was looking at her with the directness of someone who has decided to say the thing they've been holding back. I read your military file this morning, the full record with clearance. I had to make a formal request before 8 o'clock and pull in a favor. She paused. You were awarded the Navy Cross. The room was absolutely still. In a redacted operation in a location that isn't named in the citation, Calloway said, for actions that involve treating 4 critically injured personnel under direct enemy fire after the assigned medical officer was killed, and then coordinating defensive position until extraction. 3 of those 4 people are alive because of what you did. She paused again. You never mentioned that. No, Miriam said. Why, Miriam thought about how to answer that. She had given the cross to her mother for safekeeping when she had left the service because she had not wanted it in her apartment. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she did not want to look at it and be pulled back into the accounting of that day. The weight of what it had cost, the faces, the specific quality of light, the sound of the extraction helicopter that had been the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She had left it with her mother, and she had walked into a nursing program, and she had built something new. Because it wasn't the point, she said. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. It is now, she said softly. Not because it should define you, because the people in this hospital, the residents and the nurses and the patients deserve to know who is in their corner. Miriam picked up her copy of the offer document. She folded it once and put it in the pocket of her scrubs. They'll find out, she said, not from a file, from working beside me. She paused at the door. That's always been the better introduction. She walked out. She was back on the floor by 11:53. Patricia looked at her when she came through, read whatever was written on her face, and said nothing. That was the particular gift of Patricia Owens. She knew the difference between silence that was absence and silence that was presence, and she offered the second kind with the consistency of someone who had learned that it was often the more valuable one. Miriam picked up the next chart and kept moving. The afternoon had the particular intensity of a Wednesday that had decided to compensate for a slow Tuesday, which the Tuesday had not actually been, but the ER did not calibrate itself to what had already happened. It calibrated itself to right now. 2 chest pains, 1 pediatric fever that turned out to be more serious than it looked. A man who had been in a minor car accident and was fine physically, but could not stop shaking, which was its own kind of emergency and required its own kind of attention. Miriam moved through all of it with the steady pace she had always kept, the pace that was not hurrying and not slow, but always exactly where it needed to be. At 2 in the afternoon, Dana Reyes appeared at her elbow during a brief window between patients. She was holding her phone with both hands in the way people held phones when the thing on the screen was requiring them to make a decision about it. You need to see this, Dana said. Miriam looked at the screen. It was a comment thread under the morning's article. She didn't read comment threads as a rule, not because she was fragile, but because they were rarely where the signal was. But Dana was holding it toward her with a specific urgency, so she looked. The comment at the top had been shared 47,000 times. It had been written by a man who identified himself as a nurse in a level 1 trauma center in Houston. It said, I have been in this profession for 22 years. I have been dismissed, talked over, ignored, and spoken to in ways I would not describe in a public forum. What this woman did not, the needle, not the military training, but the part where she said what she saw and kept saying it, that is what it takes to save a life in this system. We say speak up for patient safety in every training. We do not always make it safe to speak up. She made it safe by not backing down. Below it, the replies were nurses, hundreds of them, from hospitals across the country. Each one a version of the same thing, a moment they had seen. Something said, something been dismissed, been talked over, been made to feel like the problem was their speaking and not the thing they had spoken about. A collective account of something that had no single incident report because it happened everywhere and had never had a face. Miriam handed the phone back. You didn't know it was going to do that, Dana said. It was not quite a question. No, Miriam said. Does it change anything for you? Miriam thought about it honestly. It changes the size of what I'm responsible to, she said. Not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do was already decided. She paused. It just makes the walls bigger. Dana nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then she said, Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Are you scared of any of it? The attention, the new role, what people are going to expect from you now? Miriam looked at her. Dana was 26 years old, 2 years out of nursing school, still building the interior architecture of the person she was going to be in this work. The question was genuine, and it deserved a genuine answer. Yes, Miriam said. Not of the attention, of doing it wrong, of having the opportunity to change something real and making the wrong moves. She paused. Fear is information. The question is whether it's pointing you towards something you should avoid or something you should walk toward anyway. How do you know which one it is? You ask yourself what happens to other people if you walk away, Miriam said. If the answer is they stay exactly where they are, you think hard about whether you're willing to own that. Dana stood with that for a moment. Then a call came from Bay 3, and she moved the way she always moved when there was something to be done, and Miriam watched her go with the particular clarity of someone who was beginning to understand the shape of the work ahead of her. The text from Kowalski came at 3:17. She was between patients, and she read it in full this time. It said, "Saw your piece. You gave Webb and Christine the credit." That's the most you thing I've ever seen in a newspaper. Also, Diaz and Reyes and Santos all saw it, and they want you to know they're proud. We all are. Also, Rodriguez named his kid after you. Just thought you should know. Kowalski. She read it twice. She did not know what to do with the information about Rodriguez's kid, which was the kind of thing that arrived from the past and sat in your chest, making itself known. She typed back, "Tell Rodriguez I'm honored, and tell him to name the next one after himself, Gray." She pocketed the phone and went back to work. At 4:45, she was in the supply room doing the restock that always fell to whoever had a free 10 minutes, because the supply room operated on the collective goodwill of whoever happened to be passing. She was counting saline bags when the door opened, and she turned to find two nurses she knew by face and shift overlap, but had never spoken with at length. Their names were Sandra Park and Yvonne Mitchell. They were both senior staff, Sandra with 7 years on the floor and Yvonne with 9. They were also, Miriam knew from what Calloway had told her that morning, 2 of the 3 nurses who had filed formal complaints against Jones in previous years. They came in together, which told Miriam the visit had been discussed and decided before they arrived. "We heard you're taking the director position," Sandra said. She was direct, which Miriam respected. "I am," Miriam said. "We wanted to talk to you," Yvonne said, "before everything gets official and formal and before it becomes a process." "All right," Miriam said. She set the saline bag down and gave them her full attention. Sandra looked at Yvonne. Yvonne looked at the middle distance for a moment, working up to something. Then she said, "When I filed my complaint 2 years ago, I was told it would be handled internally. I was told there would be a review. I was told I would be kept informed." She stopped. "I was never kept informed. I was told 3 months later that the matter had been reviewed and addressed with no details." Jones didn't change anything. If anything, he was more difficult to work with after that because he knew I was someone who would say something, and that made me a problem to him. She paused. "I almost left. I had my resignation written. I didn't send it because I couldn't afford to start over somewhere new, and I told myself that was practical and not cowardice, but I've never been completely sure." The supply room was very quiet. "That's not cowardice," Miriam said. "Staying in a place that is wearing you down and doing your job anyway that takes more than leaving." Yvonne pressed her lips together. "I need to know," she said, "if this is real. The change. Not the title, not the announcement. The actual change. I need to know if it's going to be different or if it's going to be the version of different that looks good in a press release and feels the same on the floor in 6 months." Miriam held her gaze. "I can't promise you outcomes," she said. "I can promise you process. I can promise you that when someone says something they see, I will hear it. Every time. And I can promise you that I will not let what happened to your complaint happen again while I have anything to say about it." She paused. "But I need you both to stay, because you know this place in a way I'm still learning. And I need people who have seen what doesn't work to help build what does." Sandra was very still. Then she said, "Jones was here for 11 years of this, and it took one morning to move him. One morning and 6 witness statements and a patient who would have died," Miriam said. "And 3 complaints that came before mine that created a documented pattern that the board couldn't ignore once the other pieces were in place. Those complaints mattered. They didn't feel like they did, but they were part of what made this morning possible." Sandra looked at her. Something moved through her face that was the process of revising a story she had been telling herself. It was not fast and it was not comfortable, but it was real. "Okay," Sandra said. It was one word and it contained a decision. Yvonne nodded once, the same kind of nod. Miriam picked up the saline bag and handed it to Yvonne automatically because the supply room still needed restocking and some things did not pause for their own significance. Yvonne took it without remarking on it. Sandra took the next one. The three of them finished the restock together in a workable silence, which was its own kind of agreement. The afternoon ran itself out. At 6:10, a pediatric trauma came in that required everything Miriam had and got it. A 7-year-old boy who had fallen from a second-story window, which was the kind of case that tested the specific interior discipline it took to be exactly as clear-headed as the child in front of you needed you to be, regardless of what the sight of him cost you. She was clear-headed. She did what was needed. The boy was stabilized and transferred to pediatric surgery, and she stood at the sink afterward for longer than it took to wash her hands, breathing carefully, and then she dried her hands and went back to the floor. Webb found her at 6:40. He was coming off a long call and had the look of someone who had been running since the morning and was approaching the particular transparency that came at the end of a day that had required a lot. He fell into step beside her, and for a few moments neither of them spoke, which was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when you have been through something together, and the shared experience is the conversation. "I heard about the director position," he said. "News travels. In this building at travel at the speed of the elevator gossip loop, which is roughly instantaneous." He glanced at her sideways. "How do you feel about it?" "Like I've agreed to something large," she said. "Which I have. Good large or complicated large?" "Both," she said. "Usually the same thing." He nodded. He walked with her to the end of the corridor and back the short loop that people did when they had something to say and were finding the pace for it. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he said, "about finding the actual emergency inside the noise." "What about it?" "I think I've been bad at that," he said. "I think I've been treating the noise like the emergency for most of my residency. The attending's mood, whether I said the right thing in rounds, whether someone noticed something I missed." He paused. "I've been spending a lot of energy on things that are loud but not urgent." "Most people do that for years before they figure it out," she said. "Did you, She thought about that. "I had it trained out of me in a particular way," she said. "That's not available to most people, and I wouldn't recommend the method. But the underlying skill, you can build that anywhere. You just have to keep asking yourself what is actually at stake right now, not what feels at stake. What is?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be the kind of doctor who does that," he said, "automatically, the way you do." "You're already becoming him," she said. "Yesterday, you confirmed a finding when it was easier not to. You wrote a clear and precise note. You told the truth in your account to administration without hedging it. That's the same skill. You applied it 3 times in one day." He absorbed that. She could see it settling in him, not as flattery. He was too clear-headed for it to function as flattery, but as information he was incorporating into the account of himself. That was the thing she had noticed about Webb from the beginning. He listened to be changed by what he heard. It was the rarest quality in a room full of people who listened in order to respond. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. This week." "Do better than I did," she said. "That's all the thanks I need." He almost laughed. "That's a high bar." "It's the right bar," she said, and walked away. At 7:15, she went up to the 4th floor. She had not planned to. Her shift was over, and the director paperwork Calloway's office had sent to her personal email was waiting, and she had not eaten since a sandwich at noon that she had consumed in 6 minutes standing at the nurse's station. But she went to the 4th floor because Tyler Marsh was there, and she had been thinking about him, not with clinical concern, but with the particular human awareness of a person whose life has intersected with yours at the exact moment it was deciding which direction to go. The ICU was quieter than the ER in the way that deeper water is quieter than the surface. The stillness of concentrated care rather than absent attention. The nurse at the station told her Marsh was awake and that his wife was with him and that he'd been asking questions all afternoon, which was, the nurse said with professional appreciation, a very good sign. She stood at the window of his room. He was sitting up slightly, which was different from the body that had arrived on that gurney 24 hours ago. His wife was beside him holding his hand, saying something that made him react with a weak version of an expression that wanted to be a smile and was getting there. He looked toward the window. He saw Miriam. She did not know if he recognized her. He had been unconscious when she had last seen him. His eyes closed, his body in the process of failing, until it wasn't. But his wife leaned toward him and said something, and something in his face shifted, and he raised his free hand toward the window in a gesture that was too effortful to be casual. It was deliberate. It was directed at her. She raised her hand back. She did not go in. This was not her moment to occupy. This was his and his wife's, the particular private miracle of being alive when you had been by a margin of minutes, and one correct decision, something else. She had been present for the medical part. The rest belonged to them. She turned and walked back to the elevator. On the way down, the elevator stopped at the second floor, and Dr. Sandra Reese got on, still carrying her portfolio with the look of someone finishing a 14-hour day and considering it incomplete. They rode down in silence for a moment. The committee's report was filed with the state medical board this afternoon, Reese said without preamble. Not just the internal record, the external one, Jones's conduct, the witness accounts, the prior complaints, all of it. She paused. That was my call to make, and I made it. Miriam looked at her. Why are you telling me? Because you should know, Reese said. It means this doesn't stay inside these walls. It means if he applies for privileges at another hospital, they will see this record. It means the 3 nurses who filed complaints before you will have that part of the story completed. She paused. It also means you may be contacted for further statements. I'll give them, Miriam said. The elevator opened on the lobby level. Reese stepped out and then turned back. I've been doing patient safety work for 16 years, she said. I have reviewed a significant number of incidents. What I observed in your account and in the witness statements, the clarity of your clinical reasoning under that level of pressure, after that kind of provocation, I want you to know that was not ordinary, not the procedure, the thinking. She paused. We are fortunate you were in that room. Miriam held the elevator door with one hand. Tyler Marsh is fortunate, she said. That's who it matters for. Reese looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said, and also this institution, and the nurses who are going to work under your leadership, and the patients they will fight for because of what you build. She paused. Miriam, the ripple doesn't stop at the room. The elevator doors closed. She walked through the lobby and out into the evening air, and the parking lot was doing the same thing it always did at this hour, half full, ordinary people going home to lives that had nothing to do with what happened inside those walls. She stood in it for a moment the way she had stood in it the night before, but it felt different. The same air, the same lights, the same road at the edge of the lot. But the person standing in it was standing differently, and the difference was not in anything she had become, but in what she had chosen to stop hiding. She had built her invisibility out of a genuine desire for peace. That had not been a mistake. She had needed it. The 3 years in faded scrubs and quiet mornings and early arrivals had not been wasted. They had been the proof that she could do this work for the right reasons without the weight of her history as an audience or a justification. She had learned that she was a good nurse because she was not because she had been a decorated combat medic. The nursing was his own thing, earned on his own terms, and nothing that had happened in the past 48 hours changed that. What had changed was simpler and more complicated at once. She was going to be seen. She was going to be the person who was seen doing this work, and the work was going to be larger, and more people were going to be watching, and some of those people would want something from her that she could not give them, and some would want exactly what she intended to offer, and she was going to have to know the difference. She knew the difference. She had been learning to know the difference her whole professional life, the actual emergency from the noise, the thing that mattered from the thing that was loud. She would apply the same skill here. She always had. Her phone rang as she reached her car. She looked at the screen. Her mother. She answered. I read about you today, her mother said without hello. Her mother never wasted a hello. It was one of the many things Miriam had inherited from her. I know, Miriam said. The Navy Cross, her mother said. Miriam, I have had that medal in my jewelry box for 3 years. You told me to keep it somewhere safe. You never told me it came with... She stopped. Her voice had the quality of someone managing emotion through the narrow gate of a controlled person. You saved 3 people in a firefight after the doctor was killed. You never told me that. I told you I was okay, Miriam said, which was the important part. That is not the important part, her mother said, the firm authority of a woman who had been arguing this point in various forms for Miriam's entire life. The important part is that my daughter, she stopped again, a pause that was full. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. But right now I am proud of you in a way that I don't have enough language for. Miriam stood beside her car with her keys in her hand and the evening around her and let herself receive that without deflecting it. She had deflected it for most of her adult life, the pride of people who loved her, because accepting it required accepting that she had been in the places that earned it, and accepting that meant carrying those places in a more conscious way than she preferred. But she was done deflecting. She had decided that sometime in the last 24 hours without quite marking the moment. Thank you, Mom, she said, and meant all of it. Are you eating? Her mother said, shifting with the speed of a woman who had delivered her emotional payload and was now returning to practical logistics. I had a sandwich at noon. That is not eating. That is maintenance. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll come for dinner Sunday. Good. And bring that medal home. It should be somewhere you can see it. Miriam thought about that. About the cross in her mother's jewelry box wrapped in cloth, living quietly in the dark for 3 years. She thought about what Calloway had said, that the people in this hospital deserved to know who was in their corner. She thought about what she had said back, that they would find out from working beside her. Both things were true. They were not in opposition. "I'll bring it Sunday," she said. She got in her car. She sat for a moment with the engine off and the evening settling around her. And she thought about Tyler Marsh raising his hand toward the window, and Gerald Putnam, who was going home tomorrow, and Dana Reyes, who was building herself into someone, and Webb, who was learning to find the actual emergency in the noise, and Sandra Park and Yvonne Mitchell in the supply room, and Christine, who had put a needle in her hand, and Kowalski, who had taught her the pressure point that had ended one chapter of this story and started another. She thought about a man who had grabbed her by the hair in front of 12 witnesses and found out in less than 2 seconds that she was not the woman he had decided she was. She thought about what it had cost her to be invisible for 3 years and what it was going to cost her to be visible from this point forward, and she decided clearly, without drama, with the same absolute precision she had brought to every consequential decision in her adult life, that the second cost was the one worth paying. She started the car. Miriam Gray had spent 3 years making herself easy to overlook, and a single morning making that impossible. She had not gone looking for that morning. She had not needed the validation of it, the recognition, the articles, or the calls, or the metal pulled out of a jewelry box. She had gone into that bay before dawn in worn scrub and a failing ponytail, and she had done what the patient in front of her required, the same thing she did every shift, the same thing she had always done in every room she had ever stood in, where the stakes were real and the margin was thin, and someone needed exactly what she had been trained to give. She had not chosen the fight. She had chosen every single day for 8 years in uniform, and every single day for 3 years in blue scrubs to be ready for it. And when it came, not on a battlefield, not in a language she had learned under fire, but in a fluorescent lit trauma bay, in an American hospital, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, she had been exactly who she had always been. That was the thing no one could give her and no one could take away. Not a title, not a medal, not an article or a board decision, or the resignation of a man who had mistaken power for authority and paid the price for the confusion. She had not needed any of it to know who she was. She had just needed the right moment to stop pretending she wasn't. Miriam Gray drove home through the Tuesday night, clear-eyed and certain, a woman who had chosen her life deliberately and would choose it again without hesitation every early morning, every worn ponytail, every patient who needed someone in their corner who would not move. She had always been that person. Now everyone knew it, and she was just fine with that.